Yes, it is I, Tantus Narvan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, the second edition of AD&D. Where we last left off, we've been talking about random encounters and the random encounter tables. Let's talk about when you're making this check, because we talked about the random encounter check last time. So I discussed how different terrains have different checks. Effectively, on that chart we were talking about, if it has a number listed there, you have to roll on a d10 equal to or below that number for a random encounter to occur. Now, this is also additionally modified by the time, as we discussed before. The same chart will list different times in association with those random encounters. If it has an X there, that means that's the point in time you will roll a check. The X does not mean you will have a random encounter at that time of day, at that kind of terrain. It just means it is appropriate for you to roll a check and see if at that time of day you have a random encounter. Now, this random encounter number on the chart is assuming an unpopulated area. Population density and a number of other factors can, of course, affect these numbers and alter them significantly. They could make it that it's more frequent or less frequent for you to possibly encounter a creature in one of these areas. You have to assume if an area has a decent amount of population and is regularly patrolled, you increase the random encounter percentage, the number on there for rolling equal to or below increases by 1. If it's got a high population density, you increase it by 2. Now, you as the dungeon master can add any other factors you want to this in order to increase the chances for an encounter to occur. Technically speaking, you could just choose for your players to have an encounter, but then it's not really random, then it's just you're planning an encounter, kind of. But regardless, if you feel there are factors of what's going on in the situation that would increase the chances of an encounter occurring, perhaps the players are doing something that will attract creatures' attentions, perhaps they're doing something that will reduce the chances, various things that you feel will affect the chances of actually encountering something, you can add in these factors. It's up to you completely to come up with these extra factors beyond just the basics. Now let's talk about the dungeon check, because we did talk about random encounters in dungeon. Also remember, when using the population density, this is assuming that in areas that are uninhabited and areas that are inhabited, you have two different charts for them, that you've prepared both of these different charts, and it's assuming then that there is a unique reflection between areas that have people and areas that don't have people. That's when it's appropriate to start using population density to imply, yes, if there's a lot more people around, probably better chance of encountering some of most of those people, because those are going to be more on this chart also. On the other hand, unpopulated areas, you don't have to worry much about people, it's just creatures, and creatures don't always approach adventurers. Now let's talk about the dungeon, because dungeons have random encounters too. Dungeons have their own version of a random encounter check, and they are unaffected by terrain. Effectively, the time that you're going to be rolling a dungeon check, every hour. Every hour you check if you encounter something. Now, again, let's say your PCs are being really loud, doing something that might attract monsters. You can change it up to 10 minutes. Every 10 minutes you make a check just to see if something is encountered by your players. It's also possible for you to use random encounters more strategically. If your players are kind of getting settled into what's occurring there, they thinking they're unstoppable, unbeatable, you could easily throw a random encounter on them to basically throw a wrench into their situation, basically to throw off their game, so to say, and make it that things are a little less predictable. Granted, this point in time, you are just using something you had prepared ahead of time, but it is again random because you're using it when needed. You're not planning for them to originally to hit this, only when it feels like it's appropriate. In the same retrospect, if you're in an area where random encounters could possibly occur, and you're feeling because of the situation it's going to break a lot of the tension or cause some problems with your players, especially if because you're not really trying to kill them off with random encounters, you're free to also ignore the fact that this isn't a rule set in gold. This is more of a guidelines of what's appropriate for these situations. You can remove or add in random encounters as you feel are necessary to the entire situation that's going on. Now that we have our encounter, let's talk about the number of creatures you're encountering. So how do I figure that out? Well, first I would look into any kind of monstrous manual, any kind of book that would tell me a creature guide, let me know information about the various monsters and beasts I'm having my players fight against. And each of these will, of course, give a general amount of the numbers these creatures will have. The fact is, I could use one of these numbers, or I could come up with something I feel is appropriate to the situation. That is, again, just a guideline for helping you out figure this out. A good way of thinking about this, especially if you're experimenting with figuring out numbers in these encounters, is start small. Have some kind of small encounter, lower numbers, basically test the waters with your players and see a lot of their abilities. Using these test encounters means that you can kind of judge later on about what your players can face against and defeat, and you could plan appropriately for proper numbers in your random encounter charts after that. So you can see how using a random encounter can help you design more random encounters in the future. On the other retrospect, using too many creatures and overwhelming your players isn't fun also, because effectively then you're slaughtering them off, and there isn't a lot of ways that you can fix that feel natural and not like you're going back on your word for whatever's happening to your players. I mean, you can always renege it, but players don't really like that because you're going back on what you're doing. You're reversing course. And that's kind of a dick move, but it was already a dick move setting up with so many creatures. Now, most creatures follow a basic ecology that you have to think about. It's plain and simple as that. Think of it this way. Many nocturnal predators are solitary creatures. Most animals that we know of in our world that hunt at night, solitary. Not all of them, just the vast majority of them. So fantasy-based creatures tend to act the same. Just because they're fantasy-based doesn't mean that they don't act like normal predators. During the day, when you get predators, traditionally, most large predators, at most, you might get them solitary again, or it might get them in groups of 2 or 3. If it's a group of 2 or 3, they're usually going to use some kind of strategy when striking their prey. They'll have 1 or 2 coming in from one direction, and then the other come in for a surprise attack in the other direction in attempts to weaken it and kill it. This is a strategy that many of the daytime hunters employ, basically misdirection, especially ones in small groups like this. There are also smaller predators. Maybe you have 5 to 12 of these predators and they're hunting together. Effectively, then they look for one target and they basically nip away that, weakening that one target until it's enough for them all to take it down. Herd animals, on the other hand, stay together for big groups. They also then protect the young and the old. They have them towards the center of this herd group, while the stronger and more defensive ones are going to be on the outside, protecting these younger and older ones. So you can see the natural ecology basically breaks down for a lot of fantasy monsters too. You can use this situation to give you an idea of how many creatures should be encountered. Again, because you've read through the entries on these creatures, you know if there's any kind of thing special, like this type of creature sometimes has lone wolf type creatures or solitary ones that you might encounter other than normally being in groups. Kind of think of it like elephants. You can get bull elephants off on their own, or you can get groups of family elephants. Both are two things that exist. So you don't know which you're going to encounter. It depends on which one you think is appropriate to use for this. So that's it for today. I first talked about basically rolling your random encounter check. You have to roll a d10. You have to get a number or below it. Now, your terrain determines it, which you can modify by population or random effects that you think are appropriate to modifying it. Also, dungeons have their own rules for it. Dungeons traditionally roll more often, but dungeons themselves can also roll with a higher percentage chance, especially if people in a dungeon are making a lot of noise and attracting attention to them. Then maybe, yes, you'll increase the number to 2 or 3 per maybe 10 minutes, maybe that per hour, depending on the situation that's going on. So not only in dungeons can you reduce the amount of time in between checks, you can theoretically increase the percentage chance of a check occurring. Traditionally, more you increase the time period. That's the more basic one, but the other situation in here where you do increase the actual number for dungeons does exist. Then I started diving into the number of creatures you're going to encounter, which is a balancing act. Every monster, every creature has its own entry that tells you basically how many members of whatever that is you should normally be encountering when you're going against them, or the number type groups. Now, of course, You can keep with one of these traditional ones or come up with something yourself. But you should always make sure that it's appropriate to your players, that you're not going to overwhelm them and basically beat them down. And make sure that you keep with whatever natural ecology is being established in the world that you're developing. It's going to have a basic nature. All the normal type animals, something that we'd find in our world, are going to have basically act just like they would in our world, adding the fantasy creatures in, just adding them in. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about surprise when it comes to encounters, distance, and the reactions when you encounter something. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.